Hello, folks. Thanks for tuning in. The following is an interview that I did with Dale Brown of Threat Management Center in Detroit this past week. As always, I learned some things from this interview, and I expect you will too. Dale is an innovator, a man on a mission of a labor of love. But he starts off by recognizing that many of us have been taught and conditioned with a great deal of falsehoods. Recognizing the reality of the past will help us with the future. Dale may say some controversial things and hard things to swallow, but I'd suggest that if something triggers you, you look further. There is much to learn. The bottom line with Dale is violence is a loss for everyone, and preventing violence and harm from the very beginning gives everyone a better chance and even reduces the need for government. I've broken this into three parts so it's easier to produce and hopefully view. Please forgive my interviewing and video editing skills. I'm a bit of a beginner, so, bear with me. However, even still, I think there's some gold in here, so please enjoy. All right, everyone. Today we've got an interview with Dale Brown. Welcome, Dale, to our Anarchapulco 24/7, 365, a week's worth of living, 365 days a year. Kind of, I guess we'll call it a podcast this year, this week.
All right, sounds great. So thank you for
But
having me.
I know you're a very busy man. You definitely have a lot on as far as things to do, and so we really appreciate your time. But we were hoping that you would make it to our community summit on security, and for a couple of reasons beyond our control, that didn't happen. But so glad you can make the time to do this interview.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So I'll just start off with a little bit of a story and how I heard about you initially, because it was quite a long time ago. I was actually doing a construction project in Detroit, and I was talking to one of the local contractors, and we were talking about how bad Detroit is, and I asked him a question about what is there any bright spots in Detroit? And that's when I heard your name for the first time. And so that was like a long time ago, but I've always been interested in
Nice.
the effort that you've been making towards making your community a better place. And certainly Detroit is got, it was a city that was probably the richest city in the world at one time, and now that's not the case. And so it's gone from it's been on a roller coaster ride in the last few decades. And so let's just start off with an introduction to you, Dale, and what makes you you, and where do you come from,
Well,
all that good stuff.
yes. Well, I'm originally from Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is a college town where University of Michigan is located.
Mhm.
It's a suburban city, upper middle class, approximately 150,000 residents, 50,000 of which are college kids at University of Michigan. So I grew up in a multicultural society community that was approximately 30 miles from Detroit. And I grew up with family members in Detroit, and I grew up visiting Detroit my whole life. And when I got out of the military, and after I was a licensed private investigator, I decided that my lifelong practice of martial arts to be best suited for people that needed to know how to defend themselves and understand law. And because we live in America and there's lots of guns here, an emphasis not on swords and nunchucks and throwing stars, but instead on pistols, shotguns, rifles, the understanding of batons and knives, and how you would legally use these weapons, if necessary, to defend your life. And there was no school teaching legal use of force for civilians. So I
Yeah.
thought, wouldn't it be great if there was a school where you could learn self-defense that was real, that knew the law, so you wouldn't get in trouble, and so you can defend yourself and your family and your community, your corporation, safely, and decrease the likelihood of losing money from lawsuits, as well as being prosecuted as a criminal just for defending yourself or your family. So that's where I started, was wanting to teach people how to defend themselves. And in 1994, when I moved to Detroit, 1993, 94, I noticed, I heard of a story of a young lady who was chased off a bridge in front of a crowd of people. And I thought, this is unbelievable. How could this happen in modern society? That a child could be, a woman could be chased off a bridge in front of her daughter. And I thought, if one person on that bridge had been trained by me, they could have stopped this horrible event. They could have saved this woman. They could have prevented this daughter from seeing her mother die, just with training from my program. If any of my students, if one person on that bridge had been trained by me, they could have protected the life of this young lady. And the perpetrator would have gone on to become a professional football player rather than a prisoner. He actually had a full ride scholarship and went to private school. He was a kid who got a brand new car from high school because he was going to college, and his parents were professionals, and they sent him to private school. He got upset. This woman, didn't want to date him. So he decided he was going to attack her with another guy. And he felt privileged. And as a result, the woman died, and there could have been, a different outcome had there been people training. So that's the purpose of me going to Detroit, was to help protect the people by teaching them how to protect themselves. That was the whole point, self-reliance. And I thought that's all they needed.
So you moved to Detroit with that in mind, that you saw an entrepreneurial opportunity, and that was what you wanted to do.
No, actually, I didn't see this entrepreneurship more as a life's purpose. I didn't see. I saw it as a possible viable financial future, that, there's a possibility that there could be these schools, right? But I thought Detroit would be a great place to prove it worked. I thought Detroit would not be a good financial endeavor. I thought there would be a great place to actually help people and prove the training could work. You could actually teach people, and you'd have proof that it worked. Then therefore you could take it out to the market, and then it could be a possible business in the future. That was the original concept.
Okay, great. So then you actually tried that, and how did that go?
Well, what I found out was that the people needed more than training. They needed actual protection, because it turns out the law enforcement community in urban communities, unlike the community I grew up in, the police are fixated on prosecution as a form of protection. Where I'm from, protection is the prevention of prosecution. In fact, police were very nice where I grew up, and they were always polite, and for the most part, I never saw any disrespect from a police officer. As an American of African heritage, I did not find them to be rude, disrespectful. In fact, police officers that were Americans of European heritage were helpful, just like the police officers that were African American and or Americans of African heritage. So, I didn't have any of those problems growing up. I never saw that. I saw police as positive, helpful professionals, and they all had college degrees where I'm from. Every police officer where I'm from had to have a 4-year degree.
Wow.
Not that the college makes a big difference.
Quite a bit of a difference.
It really doesn't actually overall, but I just want to say that they did have college degrees and they were higher paid, but that's not really what makes the big difference. It really doesn't. And at the end of the day, it's the perspective of the group culture. So the group culture where I'm from, the police believe their job is protect the college students, which in turn protects the tax base, which in turn protects their actual the police officers' pensions and their actual payments, their wages. If there's no college, the police department would reduce everything. So they must protect the students.
That's another great perspective, is kind of the business, and the prosperity comes from them doing their job correctly.
Correct. And in all cases. And so when there's any deviation in the enforcement of laws, it also affects negatively and adversely the economic business community, which is why police were actually created in the first place. Police were created because corporations could not make their workers go to work, because sheriff's deputies work for sheriffs, and sheriffs were voted into office. So when factory workers decided to strike for better work environments and better pay, the sheriffs would not force them back to work because they couldn't. Because if you upset the constituency, they'll simply vote in a new sheriff and vote you out. So
Yeah.
they created the police from the Pinkertons, which were a private agency, because they needed the ability for the people that fund the cities, which are the corporations, to control the enforcement of laws to keep the business flowing. So they forced the workers back to work. They beat them. They also made the workers, not stop the business. So what the unions used to do is they would stop the business. So you literally couldn't run your business because the union workers would block your business and say, we're not allowing workers in here. And they would beat you, and they would also kill your workers if they were scabs. So they
Yeah, well,
they
that's
created police
certainly,
departments for that reason.
and that's certainly something
Okay.
that Detroit has a very distinct history of.
Yes. Yes. And so the history of Detroit, which is, remarkably important to today's event, just like, who you are and who I am, is related to who, how we grew up and what our experiences were and what happened to our families, and what happened for our families. As a result, we are who we are today. The cities, towns and country towns and corporations and communities are all a reflection of their past. Detroit is simply an actual outcome from the past, and that outcome is outstanding if you're the kind of person who sees truth. If you see propaganda and you believe in Eurocentrism, the European philosophy, the European ideologies, if you embrace that, then you see Detroit as dystopia. If you understand the true story of Detroit's African American population and their resiliency, then you think of it as an amazing story of heroic promotions of survival, of Americans surviving against all odds. And Detroit's proof that the spirit of people is indomitable, that no matter how racist a society is, no matter how violent they are, people still have resilience and can still survive and thrive. So there are more Americans of African heritage that are millionaires in Detroit today than ever before. And that continues to grow every day. Of course, you won't hear about that. You'll be hearing about, poor people or people that are, not doing well. Like, for example, in Mexico, you hear only about drug lords, as though there's nobody with an actual job in Mexico. Mexico is only two things: drug lords and victims of drug lords. Unless you're American visiting a nice place like Acapulco, then it's a vacation area. So you're a vacationer in Mexico. You're either sex trafficked, or you're killed, or you're a drug dealer. So that's all you have. So these fantasies of these are Eurocentric fantasies that are not true. They're just not. It's just not realistic. Mexico is not that place where only people that do illegal things live and they're victims. Detroit is not a place where African Americans are starving and poor and gang members and all this craziness. This is a fantasy of the European mindset, the European American mindset, that is rooted in supremacy and inferiority of those who are not Americans of European heritage, and specifically Anglo-Saxon Christian Protestant, because we have a very serious history here of hating Jewish people as a society here. The Jews were they had to fight the Italians had to fight, and they were removed. The Italians couldn't run their businesses here. There's very few Italian businesses, no Little Italy here. We do have a Mexican town here. The Mexicans were able to come in, but the Canadians bought all of their restaurants, which is interesting, with the exception of like maybe 10%. So even though you see Mexican people working at a restaurant, 99% of the restaurants are owned by Canadians now. But at least they had kept real Mexican, people working there, so you got real Mexican food being fixed. However, we don't understand the history of Detroit, but yet we have an opinion about Detroit, which is really disgusting. It's sort of like people who think of Mexico in all those negative terms, and really just so limited. The concept of Mexico is so vast, the history of it, that it's unbelievable. And yet people are so ignorant to Mexico. Detroit is the same way. It's just, and then there's a lot of misinformation.
We definitely share that in common.
Yes, yes. So everything you're thinking about Detroit is wrong. Every single thing you think about Detroit. Every aspect of it is completely wrong. And most of the people in Detroit are extremely ignorant to Detroit's history as well. So keep that in mind.
Wow.
So you're talking about people that don't study, they don't know anything about Detroit's history 9 times out of 10, and the people who live here know the least about Detroit. And that's because no one really studies. Americans hate knowledge and information and education in the first place. Etymology is really just annoying. So we just choose to make words mean what we want them to mean today, even though it's not what the words mean. So that's just a common
Well,
American thing.
I think that's I think that's certain people do take advantage of that, and that's
Yeah.
why it's
Which is
painful.
normal. It's just normal human behavior. You know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
normal human behavior. So in order for us to combat, to resist the negatives of human behavior, we have to embrace psychology. We have to understand how the human mind works. What is bias? What is unconscious
Absolutely agree.
bias? Why is bias subconscious? Why
Yeah.
why is most of our behavior compulsive? Yet we keep talking about why things happen and act like they're actually something we do conditionally that's based upon our decision making, which most things are not. What makes you talk the way you talk, act the way you act, those things were taught to you as a baby before you can even talk. You were being programmed,
Yeah.
and that's in your first formative years. And those
Absolutely.
behaviors are programmed in you. You can reprogram yourself, but it's very difficult. That's
It
why
is. It
most
is.
big people
It's
come from
definitely
big families.
difficult in that environment. I do
Yeah,
believe that
yeah,
it isn't as
every
difficult as
environment.
people think, but and have encountered. But it's got a lot to do with their lack of understanding about how much of their mind is occupied by bad programming that is all kind of like little traps set that go off as you try and improve yourself. You
No,
end up
no, no, no. It doesn't have to do
falling
with
into
good or
it,
bad.
I say.
It has nothing to do with good or bad. So your biases and your compulsive behavior is just you. It's not good or bad. It's just who you are. So why do you talk the way you talk? Why do you act the way you act? Why do you eat the way you eat? That is because your parents showed you that when you were a baby or whoever raised you.
Yeah.
That's not your decision. So you can reprogram yourself to eat less or eat more. That's your choice. Okay. It's just
Yeah.
very hard to do that. But to act as though, you are who you are just because that's not true. You are the way you are. And these are psychologically, um, true human behaviors that are related to subconscious conditions of the human mind.
Yes.
And so
I
my
agree.
point in saying that is until we understand psychology determines your behavior, we don't understand a lot about, why people do the things they do. So then imagine being inculcated into a belief system on top of your thought processes being subconscious. Imagine then also you not understanding how impressions, visual, video, pictures, impressions, um, that are explained to you auditorily, meaning people tell you stories, or things
Yeah.
you see in videos and pictures, how those things form impressions in your brain. So, for example,
Absolutely.
Americans of African captive heritage, we do not have our family name, our family language, and our family land of origin. We don't know where we're from in Africa. We don't know
Yeah.
our family names from Africa. We don't know our family religion, our family language. We know nothing about those things. So as a result, we have no actual human culture. Our culture is that of our captors. So imagine someone, took you captive, tortured you,
Yeah.
raped you, and then you became, whatever their religion is, whatever their name. They give you new names. Their name, the person who captured you. Now imagine millions of people, right? So millions of people. So we are Americans of African captive heritage, but we are essentially just European Americans with tans. So we have all the same values, all the same skin color. I mean, we even have the same skin color in millions of cases. Blue eyes, green eyes, extremely pale skin, like Mexicans. There's blonde-haired Mexicans. There's also Afro-Mexicans that are, extremely dark complected. So
Mhm.
just like Mexicans come in all different shades, so do Americans of African heritage. And so the concept that we're operating under, when we talk about Detroit, for example, or any other historic thing, is very myopic and very limited. And as a result, we're trying to have a complex conversation, but we want to have it in a very limited way from a singular perspective that is nefarious, built on nefarious narratives, which is not realistic. It's not even true. So it's imperative to have truthful conversations so that you
Oh,
can have
absolutely.
meaningful dialogue, so you can have a positive outcome and an appropriate evolution. This is what
Absolutely.
my purpose of communicating is for positive evolution. which is impossible if we just simply embrace lies and keep teaching those lies. Christopher Columbus did not sail the ocean blue in 1942. Okay,
Yeah,
Christopher
yeah,
Columbus raped children. Christopher Columbus massacred people. Christopher Columbus
absolutely,
did not like
absolutely.
Mexicans. Mexicans did not exist, but he did like to rape the native people of the region that we call Mexico and give them Hispanic names from Spain. And
Yeah,
so, and the religion from Spain, which is Catholicism. So once we understand, our history of our regions, we can also understand, everything about ourselves, or begin to understand everything about ourselves. But imagine if we said, you know what, we don't want to understand the history, but we want to discuss a dialogue about today's events. That's literally impossible to do that and be constructive and appropriate. Detroit is a place with, you know, thousands of Americans of African heritage that own luxury boats, yachts, and yet you have not seen any of them on any media. But if you go to
yeah,
YouTube right now, if you go to you probably find stuff on YouTube too. But if you go to Google and you Google Detroit marinas, you'll see all these marinas, and there's boats there.
yeah.
Those are 90% owned by Americans of African heritage, and they're in the third generation of ownership of luxury boats. But how come you only hear about dystopia in Detroit, poor people, right? You
Yeah,
don't hear that the
yeah,
majority of African Americans in this country, Americans of African heritage, captive heritage, the majority of them that have doctors, license, and are judges and lawyers, they are from Detroit.
yeah.
So why is that? Why would Americans of African captive heritage be from Detroit? It doesn't make sense. It's a cold place. There's no plantations here. There never were plantations. So why was that possible? That's because European Americans decided that they were not going to meet the needs of the military quota without disrupting business if their needs were not met according to their feelings, according to their union rep from the Black Legion. Do you know what the Black Legion is?
That's getting in the area. I'm not sure.
Black Legion controlled all of the corporations here in Detroit, all the factories
Okay.
that made majority of obviously our war effort. And the reason that's important is because that
So
they
we're talking
decided
like
they were not going to let.
secret society type
No, not secret
individuals.
at all. Yeah, sort of, but not really.
Okay.
Like the
All right.
KKK is secret, right? They're not really secret. They're very out in the open. But they didn't have parades, but they're military. So the difference between them and the KKK is these guys had rank.
Yeah.
This is in the 20s. This is in the
Okay.
20s when African Americans came from the South to come to the factories to get jobs because
Yeah.
they were promised fair pay. And Henry
Yeah.
Ford did that to break the back of the Union. And the Packard plant was the first place to hire Americans of African captive heritage outside of the line, outside of the line. Excuse me, outside the garbage room. So as a result, 20,000 European Americans walked off the job and said they would rather lose to Germany and salute Hitler than work next to an N-word. So
Okay.
they 20,000 men walked off the
This
job
was in the 20s or in the
in the 20s.
okay. So that would
I'm
be
sorry,
World
1942.
War One.
That was officially
Oh, okay. All right.
1942.
All
1942.
right.
So there have been 10 years of strife that have been taking place as Americans of African captive heritage were moving north for jobs and also businesses. So my family was the first, my great-grandmother was the first American of African captive heritage that was a licensed doctor in the state of Michigan. Her husband,
Wow.
my great-grandfather, was one of the first African-American doctors.
Yeah.
And the reason why she was because she looked like a German woman. So she was, we're all mixed Europeans. There's no purebred slaves. Okay, let's be clear. If you are a captive in American chattel slavery, you have a European relative or 10. And so all of us have our names of our European ancestors. So
And
that's what
then
makes the concept of race and race war and fighting and the concept of your skin color being some kind of ethnic identity is so insane, right? Mexicans are not Mexicans because they're tan. Mexicans have a name, they have a language, they have a religion, they have a family connection, right? Okay,
Yeah.
that's what makes you Mexican, not because you're tan. So,
Yeah, well,
um,
Dale,
yeah,
I don't want to go into this too far, but
yeah,
we also share something that's kind of unique, and that is that you spent some time in Germany and Europe and traveling around because was it your mother that was in the military as well as a doctor?
yeah.
Okay,
Yep. So I come
yeah.
from a family of doctors. Yep. And
So
so the reason
you
why
spent
I,
a few years living in
mhm,
Europe and kind of
yeah,
being able to
Germany.
be
Yeah.
exposed to a bunch of different cultures, and that's certainly something. I was in the army myself, and I spent 2.5 years living in Germany, and
Mhm.
that exposure to a different culture really gave me a lot more of a perspective on, you know, wow, Americans, they've got some real strange, ideas about how society operates. Now once you get comparison to like a European version of that or a different culture, and at least for me, that's how I came to some conclusions that were different because I just never knew
Mhm.
there was any other way until I started to see the Europeans, and then of course traveling around Europe, seeing some of the different cultures. And it's definitely one of the reasons that I really feel comfortable living in Mexico. Is the difference in culture and how much different it is from
Mhm. Yes.
the
Well,
United
it's
States
imperative to understand the
experience.
history of everything to understand the current conditions of a thing. And so
Yeah,
one of the things we find is that people don't concern themselves with history, and as a result of not understanding the history, they can't understand what they're looking at now. Yet they still have an opinion. So
yeah,
imagine trying to understand Mexico now without understanding where Mexico came from, without understanding the Indians, the natives that lived there, and how they were raped by the Spaniards in the first place. Uh, like as though Catholicism just appeared out of there, it just popped up. Imagine believing the Mayans died off. Imagine believing, which is what the Eurocentric idea is, that they just died. They're just not true. They're still there now.
yeah.
Um,
They just ran out
oh,
of technology or whatever.
well, they moved and migrated based on how humans move with food and water and everything else, and
Yeah,
survival, right? Because Europeans were killing them and giving them
yeah,
diseases.
yeah.
Let's
Well,
be clear. You
that's it. That's exactly what was
yeah. So I
happening
mean,
is that they were being
so if
eradicated.
we don't understand our history of that, we're like, oh, it is what it is. No, it's not. It is what it is. We created it. And so by understanding how
Yeah,
to create how we created the problems, here's what we can do. We can
yeah,
understand how not to do it again. Okay?
absolutely.
If we don't understand the history, we can't understand the conditions, so we can't change it for the better in the future. In fact, all the ideas we're going to come up with in ignorance of the past is going to be deleterious to the future. We can actually ruin the future by not understanding the past. And that's in all things.
Definitely agree.
Imagine if you didn't know that going to McDonald's is not good for you. So you want to change everything but that. So you can keep going to McDonald's wondering why things aren't going well for you. Well, maybe you're not
Yeah,
supposed to eat there. Did you think of that? Right?
yeah,
So once we understand, uh, the history of a thing, then we can understand how to make changes so we don't have the current conditions continue in the future. But as you can see, people are very resistant to change,
oh,
and
absolutely.
they do not like change, and they do not like those that bring change. And I am an
Yep,
agent of change.
yep.
Okay, so that's how I define
Man,
myself. I'm an iconoclast
I'm
and an agent of change.
I'm telling you, Dale, man, we have just so many things in common. And my younger brother is a big, he's a professional executive, junior executive, I guess, in a credit union in Pensacola, Florida. And he represents himself well, but one of his real, expertise is about creating change. And
Hmm.
he's an expert at it. But uh, I love
Yeah.
what you're talking about. Let's talk about your solutions in regard to what you've done in Detroit to solve people's problems
Well,
and be
right,
an
right.
entrepreneur doing it.
Yeah, yeah, actually. And so the thing is to understand, why is Detroit the way it is now? Because without understanding that, how would I exist? Why would I exist? Right?
Yeah,
So the reality is, Detroit is a place that when Americans of African heritage, captive heritage, began to ascend financially, when they got the jobs, when they got the economics, they sent their kids to college, they started buying businesses and opening businesses and thriving. the European
Yeah.
Americans decided to kill them and attack
Yeah.
them and destroy their businesses, and then use the city government and the state government to try to shut them down consistently for many years. They also
Yeah.
used the police in squad. There was a squad here called Stress, and essentially they went around. Stress was an acronym that said there was something like "Save Our Streets" or something. I don't remember. I don't know it because I wasn't here then. But
Yeah.
people often would accuse my organization of being a wing of this police organization called Stress, which we are
Yeah.
not, nor have we ever been. And so once people found out we were not Stress, we were actually here to help them. They were very positive. Um, but apparently, Stress was known for randomly grabbing Americans of African captive heritage and then their family members not seeing them anymore. Um, and so as a result, the mayor that switched it all around came into power by saying, listen, I will get rid of this police organization if you will vote me into office. So that's how Coleman A. Young, the first African American mayor, became the mayor of Detroit. And then from that point forward, he was attacked. The city was attacked. All the major businesses left Detroit. They started to, they gave Middle Eastern people here, the state gave them tax benefits that they did not give
Yeah.
to the indigenous people. So as a
Yeah.
result, the businesses here are mostly Chaldean, Iraqi. They're Muslim and Chaldean, and the alcohol is sold by Chaldeans, and the non-alcohol, which is the gas stations, are owned by Muslims. But they don't have to pay taxes to the state. They get all kinds of other benefits, and they're also self-funded in many cases. So they created their own groups. They also have underground illegal activities that the FBI is constantly arresting people for. And as a result, they have created a climate that makes it so that there's this constant destabilization of the entire
Yeah.
economy here. And the Americans of African heritage, African captive heritage, they are subjected to over scrutiny by policing and by the state and any other organization that can destroy their businesses. So my great-grandparents, who opened the first African-American hospital, licensed private hospital, handed it down to my great-grandfather, who was also a doctor. And what they did was they decided, okay, so the way the business works, and a lot of people don't understand this, libertarian communities, freedom communities, volunteer societies, they don't understand business. So they support it, but
Yeah.
they don't understand it, right?
Yeah.
So once we got rid of the concept of um, uh, skin-related services, meaning the hospitals were now going to be operated by Jews, and that the tax dollars from everyone will be used for that. So African American tax dollars used to be used for hospitals that they couldn't go to. So that was considered illegal, found to be illegal. So now African American tax dollars has to go to a hospital that they can also attend, that they can go to. And as a
Yeah.
result, Jewish hospitals came into power. And what they did to make sure that African Americans go to their hospitals is they outlawed their private hospitals. The way they did that, the state did it, right? They used state laws, okay? They didn't, outlaw skin color based hospitals. What they did was said, okay, this hospital is no longer licensed as a hospital because of
Yeah.
XYZ.
Right.
Either your roof's not tall enough, your door's not wide enough, you don't have proper electricity, whatever. There's always some kind of, law, right? Now, then you look up and you say, well, how come African Americans or Americans of African heritage, African captive heritage, don't have their own private hospitals? Well, they did. Now,
Yeah.
once you move into big business, which is the larger hospitals that are corporate owned and corporate ran, they want all of the shares of the people needing health care. So they got all of the private, smaller hospitals considered to be outlawed by changing the laws, right? And then you had to
Yeah.
go to the larger Jewish-controlled hospitals. And that's where we're at now. So right now, all the hospitals that are licensed hospitals are not Americans of African captive heritage, even though there were many at one point. And so
Yeah.
as a result, you have to look at that systemically. So right now, you would have people actually ask us, and I say this, well, if you wanted a better hospital, why don't you just build one? What do you
Yeah.
mean? They were already here. If you wanted a store, why didn't you just make one? They were already here. The stores were over
Yeah.
scrutinized, and then they were also so when the first person to buy a house here, like my building, I own a building here in Detroit.
Yeah.
my building says on the deed, do not sell to Negroes. That's from the bank, not from the state. Okay? You're not allowed to sell homes and businesses to Negroes. All right? So that's what the civilians were doing. It's not the government,
Yeah.
not the state. Okay?
Yeah.
Now, when you buy a home in Detroit in 1925 that's outside of Black Bottom, which is the area that Americans with African captives were able to live, the people would riot against you and attack you and your family. And Ossian Sweet is the reason why so many, you could say a million people left because Dr. Ossian Sweet, which is an American of African captive heritage, shot 4 businessmen that were Americans of European heritage that attacked his family in their home. And it was the first time in the history of America that an American of African captive heritage, shot and killed an American of European heritage and did not get lynched or given the death penalty. As a result, a million Americans of European heritage decided to leave Detroit immediately when they found out he wasn't going to go to prison.
Yeah.
Okay? He beat the court case because, you're allowed to defend your home. But there were riots outside of his home. Hundreds of people were rioting because he bought a house. Okay? And so the big riot here in Detroit was 1942, but everyone talks about the riot of 1968. Okay? Those are mass exodus events of Detroit, of the European Americans who decided to leave and not have neighbors that were tan.
Yeah.
As a result, they also decided to destroy the property values. Banks would not loan money to fix up their homes. So imagine corporations ignoring the community, states refusing to provide them with necessary services, and the private sector deciding they're not going to service these people. As a result, you have dystopia, a dystopian environment, and most importantly, the police never changed their purpose from prosecution of those who are different to those who are, in need of protection, right? And so Americans of African captive heritage that became police officers were even more inappropriate than those that trained them. So that's another despicable problem. It's psychologically driven, right? And so I say all that to say that without all of that, why would I need to be here? Right? There would be no reason, no impetus for me to be in Detroit if all that destabilization of the population had not occurred. So imagine trying to understand Detroit now without understanding all those historical events and how they destroyed the economic base and the societal structure of the families that still survived it. There are people there right now that were here the whole time. They're 70, 80, 90 years old. They were here through all of these horrific mass societal oppressive, discriminatory conditions, and they survived and they thrived. So these you won't hear about it, but you will hear from me.
That is truly resilient, and that's one of the things that we learned from we our last community summit. We had a couple people from the Council for the Chiran people in Mexico, the city of natives that are indigenous people that effectively took their town back from the criminals and the local corrupt police, and have done it their way. And they had to go through years and years of all kinds of power being shut off, the phone service being shut off, all kinds of different things, but they stuck together, and the resilience is truly amazing. And certainly I think that's what we're talking about.
That's what I was saying to you. I don't understand it, because that right there, that kind of tribalistic situation in America is horrific for America historically. I mean, horrific. So I don't understand. Absolutely. That's why I said I'm really interested to see how that plays out down there and how it played out in the actual application, because I know what it did here. Here it destroyed entire communities. It destroyed vast amounts of people. Just huge major massacres took place and other things. So it's great to hear that that, that's
Yeah,
not
well,
happening there,
I
but
mean,
somehow they
that's
overcame that.
they've been. This is 11 years of going, and it's after quite a few years of all kinds of different intimidation and threats and violence and so forth. But they stuck to their guns, and
Who's in charge?
they eventually took it to the Supreme Court of Mexico, and they basically won their sovereignty. Uh, but
Who's in charge?
well, they have a kind of a unique way of it's almost like their tribal traditions to a large degree are what they're relying on, and they've got a they when they visited they gave me a hat and it says on it, um, and pardon me if I screw up the Spanish on this, but usos e costumbres no partidos políticos, which means it's our traditions and customs, not political parties. And that's kind of
Mm,
their 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 motto, I guess, to some degree.
mm,
But they have like local neighborhood meetings where they have like a direct democracy. They vote representatives that go to the main council, and there's I think 12 people on the main council, and each one serves 3 years, and then they change, and they're all just people from the community, and then of course they all have direct connection. Like there's no secret ballot or anything. People know who is supporting them all the way down to the last person, because when they do their election, it's like they stand in front of the person that they're supporting. And so
interesting.
it's
What's the demographics there?
in regard to like
Different populations, different
as
populations
far
of
as
people.
as far as their racial background and stuff like that, or the heritage.
Ethnic. Yeah, there's no such thing as race, but ethnic
Yeah,
background.
yeah. Well, they're generally the majority is the indigenous, and